Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of Life Beyond Loss, the podcast. This is the final episode of Season 2, where we share the most amazing and inspirational stories of grief and loss, and navigating that through to often healing and transformation. I'm your host, Louise Kresick, grief and loss coach, and in this last episode I'm talking to Lisa Richards, who has spent 25 years working as an urban designer and is now, through her own experience of loss, fully trained as a grief recovery specialist and setting up her own business, which is very exciting. So in this episode we talk all about Lisa's experience of grief and loss, how that's really manifested itself over a very long period of time for Lisa, but how the grief recovery method actually did help her to release that grief in the end. So this is really useful, really great chat. It's really interesting, and I encourage you to stay tuned and listen into this fabulous episode. Season 2 with the lovely Lisa Richards, and Lisa's not too far away from me, actually, are you? What you're in Shropshire, right, Lisa?
I'm based in Shrewsbury.
There we go. So Shrewsbury, so not too far away from me at all. And I hope you've got a bit better weather than we've been having over the last couple of weeks.
It's looking a little dark out there. Looks like it's going to rain. So we'll just have to kind of cozy up in here and pretend, we'll just ignore the outside for now.
Yeah, that's fine. It's all good. We're used to putting our wellies on anyway.
We are.
So anyway, and speaking of wellies as well, and I know that obviously you have an amazing and very interesting background, particularly in urban design. But also you've got a new venture. So go on, share some more with us then about, what you're doing and, what you've been up to and stuff.
Okay, well, just to give you a little bit of background, I qualified as an urban designer 25 plus years ago, and that's been my career for the last 25 years. But over the past couple of years, I've become increasingly aware that the grief I suffered when I was a lot younger, when I had my teens, and one particular event that we'll come to that perhaps threatened to define me and define my life, I addressed through counselling. I went through a lot of heartache to try and overcome this, but try as I might, I could not get rid of the weight of grief that was inside. So while I felt better through counselling, and I felt better for all the therapies that I did subsequently, I could never let go of my grief until 2 years ago when I discovered something called the grief recovery method. And I did it. I signed up to do it, and miraculously, I let 30 years of grief go almost in an instant. It was the most amazing experience I've ever encountered. And consequently, a little spark went off inside my head. And I thought, if I'd known this however many years ago, what would I have given for somebody to have told me about this and offered it to me? And so when I'd done it myself, I thought, actually, maybe I can be the change that I hoped had been there for me at the time, but maybe I can help somebody else through my experience and from what I've learned and now offer to people. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that I'm now a grief recovery specialist, although I badge myself as a loss and well-being specialist.
Fabulous. What a beautiful transition though through, I suppose it's almost like a recreation of your life, really, isn't it? Because it feels very much to me the way you're kind of describing it is obviously you've had this experience which is always maybe kind of sat in the background and been sort of bubbling away, and you carry on as, you know, life as normal, doing the job, blah blah blah, and then all of a sudden you discover this grief recovery method and things kind of, like you say, this spark goes off, and then this sort of really transitions you into a totally different kind of future, really, which is just amazing, isn't it? It's, you know, and this is what I love about so many people that I'm speaking to in terms of their experience of loss, which we will talk about in a moment, but how it's actually impacting them in the future, a bit further down the line, in a very kind of positive way, and kind of changing their life in a very positive way as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that I feel as though I've been given a second chance at life, which, you know, for a long time I thought I would never be truly happy, and that's not only a reality now, I'm living it every day now.
So we'll come back to the grief recovery method in a bit, because I want to explore that a bit more. But would you mind sharing with us a little bit more then about this story you said about, you know, this experience of loss that you had when you were younger, and how that maybe kind of affected you?
Yes, I can do that. Okay, I am from a family where I had a brother, a younger brother. So I had a mom and dad who had two children. My dad was an electrical engineer at a local cabling company. And my mom was, well, originally she stayed at home while we were at school, but when I started secondary school, she started doing a little part-time work. And so they both worked to a certain degree, but my dad was the full-time breadwinner. Throughout my life, my father was seriously ill at times. So when I was born, he was actually in hospital at the time. He had Crohn's disease, which can affect people very severely at times. And certainly at least 3 periods throughout my life, we thought he was seriously ill and we thought he was going to die. So that was the sort of up and down sort of way things went. Now, when I was younger and my father was in hospital, my mom was very anxious. Not only was she suffering from postnatal depression, I think, but she was anxious that she was married to somebody who may die and may leave her with 2 small children to look after and to bring up. And the anxiety of that and the stress of that, I think, always was in the background with my mom. So my dad was quite up and down in terms of his health. My mom, general good health, but mental health was up and down. So in some ways they complemented one another. And that's kind of how it went for quite a long time. I went to secondary school outside my local area. So I had friends that were outside the town where I lived. So I had to travel if I wanted to see any of them. And I aspired to go to university because that's what I wanted to do, and that's what my parents wanted. They felt that my education was very, very important. And one day somebody came to talk to us, and it was an architect, a lady architect came, and she inspired me to become an architect. So when I went to university, when I finally got enough qualifications to go, I actually went to study architecture. It was only later that I actually slipped into urban design and decided that was more what I was interested in, what I was passionate about, and what I could do really well. So that was the sort of backdrop. The first year of college, I went away. I think my mom was suffering from a little bit of empty nest syndrome and went into a little bit of a decline and a depression. And certainly my first term, she went in and stayed in a psychiatric hospital for a while, receiving medical treatment, really, just to help her just function on a day-to-day level, I think. I don't know, because I actually wasn't there. All I know was that she was receiving treatment, and when I came home at Christmas, she came home and she seemed withdrawn. She seemed very quiet, but at least she seemed fine on the surface. But then maybe I was very buoyant, and I'd come home from my first term at college. It was all very new and exciting, and that was great, So things kind of went a bit like that until the end of the first year. Again, I came home. I was aware that my parents were struggling a little bit with my mum being so depressed and anxious. So I came home, I helped out as much as I could. I took a temporary job and just kind of did that for a while. On the day that I finished this temporary job, with a view to going away with my new college friends, I came home to find that my mum had taken to her bedroom. On going up to see her and to say hello, I opened the door, she was asleep. So I left her to it. I went downstairs and I started making the tea. Because it was a Friday, my dad came home early on a Friday. He came in, he asked me where my mum was. I told her she was upstairs, and he went up to see her. I didn't really think anything more until probably not that long later. My dad rushed down the stairs and he'd called the doctor. The doctor came, and then my father had also called for an ambulance. And what I didn't realise at the time was that my mum wasn't sleeping. So they rushed her out to hospital. My dad went with her in the ambulance, and my grandparents came to look after myself, although I didn't need looking after. My father said, just call your grandma and grandpa and get them over here. So I did. And I didn't really think anything more about it, other than I phoned a family friend who was like like a big sister to me. And she came over, and she'd been a nurse. That was her background. And I told her what had happened, and immediately she said, let's just go upstairs and have a little tidy round. And I went, oh, okay. So I went up, very naively followed her upstairs. And we went in the bedroom, and as I opened the door, I suddenly caught sight of my mum's dressing table, which had a series of photographs of us as a family. And they were family photos that had normally been around the house. So it struck me as very unusual and odd that somehow these had all arrived on this dressing table, and they were all propped up almost in a line. So there was something not right, and my friend said, well, just have a look around and see what you can find. So she went and had a probe underneath the bed and found an empty bottle of gin. And then she said to me, just have a look in any of the drawers and see whether you can find anything like an empty bottle of pills. And I did. And suddenly the light bulb went on, and, the realization of what had happened. Just couldn't quite believe that she was that low that she would do that. But so because of the shock, I went downstairs, I phoned my dad, I told him what pills that we thought she'd had, what alcohol she'd swallowed, so obviously that he could give that to the paramedics and the medical staff at the hospital. And we waited. Later, when my dad came home, he said that she died and had been revived on the way to the hospital, and although she was in a serious condition, she was stable. And so I was, as I say, I was due to go on holiday the next day with my new friends, and I rang my best friend and said, I can't really tell you what's going on now, but just believe me, it's serious enough that while I really, really would love to come on holiday, I can't. But as soon as I can tell you something, I'll let you know. So I left it at that. And the following morning I got up and we were all just kind of milling around having breakfast because we didn't know what else to do. And my dad said to me, I think you should go on holiday. And I said, but how can I go on holiday when my mom's in, intensive care and fighting for her life? And my dad said, look, go on holiday. You can phone every day, and if something happens, you can come home. And so reluctantly I did go away, but obviously I couldn't quite relax. And by the time I came back a week later, because nothing had happened, she just stayed in hospital. They monitored her progress and they tried to obviously understand what was going on. And so I didn't see her until a week later. And I'll never forget it. I walked into the hospital, into the room where she was. She was in a sort of open ward of 6 beds. She was sitting in the corner. She was actually sitting in a chair, and she was wearing this white nightie or white gown, and she looked like a ghost. Her hair was deathly white. Her skin was as pale as snow, and she just had this very haunted look on her face. She looked at me and then just closed her eyes, almost to dismiss me. That, I don't know whether it was embarrassment. I don't know what it was, but from that moment on, I realised nothing. Well, I'd worked out nothing was ever going to be the same, but I went in with that hope that, it was going to be all right. And unfortunately, it wasn't. At the time, the doctors said that she may recover, she may snap out of it, and she may be fine, but she never did. So what happened was, by taking the alcohol and pills, unfortunately, she damaged her brain. So although she had long-term function, she didn't have any short-term memory. So while she knew who I was when I was born, all things that she could remember about when I was little, she didn't know what day of the week it was. She didn't know, if she'd have been at home and put the kettle on or put the fire on, she wouldn't have remembered. So she couldn't actually look after herself. So when she actually finally came home, my dad was working full time still, and eventually realised that he couldn't continue the way he was going. So he actually decided to take retirement from work and look after her, which, considering that a lot of men, I think, would be absolutely horrified by that situation and would almost not want to deal with that day to day. He did. He decided that he was so grateful that she'd looked after him while he was seriously ill, that he would do the same. He took his vows very seriously. And that's the way it happened. My dad looked after my mum for the rest of his life. And she never recovered, apart from just before she died, a few years ago, where for 10 minutes, it's almost like something snapped on in her brain. And she said, she almost woke up and said to me, Lisa, what am I doing in this hospital bed? Where's your dad? It was almost like she was Snow White and somebody had kissed her and she'd woken up. It was very surreal, and it was lovely. And I was so glad that I was there for that few minutes that she was lucid, because I'd waited so long to see it. But unfortunately, it never happened again. And I didn't see her again after that. She died after that, the day before I was due to go and see her again. So, yes, that's the event that kind of defined my life for a long, long time, to the point where I carried it around with me because I didn't know what else to do. We didn't really speak about it. It was at a time where there wasn't really counselling available. And because she didn't die, she wasn't recorded as a suicide. And so the statistics about how many people actually take their own lives, there is that knock-on effect of it's not just about them, it's about wives, children, all those people who actually get affected, who also need support. And unfortunately, we got none of it. And yeah, it's tragic and very sad looking back. But I carried that around with me for so long that it wasn't until 10 years later that I actually broke down with it. The weight of that, carrying that around for such a long, long time.
I was going to ask you, actually, Lisa, whether, were you aware that it was something that was sort of, weighing you down and was there in the background, or was it like sort of a moment sort of 10 years later where you had a bit of a sudden realisation that was the thing that you needed to maybe deal with?
I think at the time I struggled with it. I didn't want to make any demands on my father because he was having enough trouble. His wife had just tried to take her own life. He was struggling to go to work and provide a stable home for us, for my brother and myself. So I probably looked to my brother because he was a sibling, he was a child like me, although I was older. But my brother just clammed up and has never really spoken about it. He's better than he used to be, but he doesn't really like speaking about it at all. So I dealt with it very much in my own way. And the way I dealt with it, because I learned from what I saw around me, because I had nothing else to go on, was I kept calm and carried on. And I didn't
thing.
Yes, it is. And I think that's the thing. I didn't realise how it would affect me until much, much later, when I started to feel stressed and feel physical symptoms where headaches, joint pain, eczema, things where if you are not externalizing it vocally, your body then finds other ways to try and stop you and make you take note that actually there is something that you need to deal with. But again, I didn't understand. It's only through that sort of gradual process where you realise something's not quite right and you have to do something about it. And what actually happened to me to kind of force this was I plan, when I came to work in Shrewsbury, so when I came to live in Shrewsbury and I had a job and I seemed to be making great strides, I was loving my job, I was really starting to make friends here, really starting to establish my life away from my family, but close enough to give them support if I needed. So there was that kind of, there's a public face of me in Shrewsbury, but there's also this sort of private face of me that I kind of keep not hidden, but I don't advertise. And it was, I literally had decided to go to my cousin's wedding in Australia, and I'd saved enough money to go. I'd got enough holiday combined together to give me a month off work, and I went on the trip of a lifetime around the world to Australia. And it was the most amazing trip. I thought, wow, I've really made it here. This is going to be fantastic. It was only when I got to Australia and I saw my family, and because I say my aunt lives out there, and my cousins live out there, and they live in Perth. And then I went over to Sydney to spend some time with my godmother, and my godmother asked me what had gone on, because she'd never, my dad had told her something, but obviously not told her the full story. And I remember recounting it to her and thinking, and I thought I'd come round the world to escape, when actually it's all still here. I'll never escape because it's inside. And that sudden realization that I couldn't escape what was going on inside in my mind. And so when I came back from Australia, that escape, that dream holiday had ended, and I just plummeted like a stone. Although I went back to work, and everything seemed to be fine. And then one morning, it wasn't long after I'd been back, I got up on a Friday morning, and I remember it very vividly. I just thought, I cannot see how I'm going to make this to the end of the day. I just feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I don't feel suicidal. I feel suicidal in the sense that I think this might be the kind of feeling that my mum experienced, because nobody knows what she felt and how desperate she felt. But I could see it might be like what I was feeling. The difference was I knew I wouldn't hurt myself. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what to do.
Wow.
And at that point in time, I thought, I deliberated for a long, long time. I paced up and down. I screamed at myself. I was in tears. And I did the only thing that I knew what to do, which was actually, I picked up the phone and phoned my father, and I told him how I was feeling. And I didn't want to do it because I thought, he must be thinking, oh my goodness, what's happening? You know, my wife's tried to kill herself, and now my daughter's thinking of doing so as well. And I tried to reassure him. I said, look, Dad, I'm not going to do anything, but I do feel so helpless, and so I just really don't know what to do. And so he very calmly and collectedly gave me a plan. He said, I think you should phone up your GP, don't take no for an answer, book an emergency appointment, sit in front of them and explain what's going on, and phone me when you've done it. And that simple instruction, that simple plan, because I couldn't think what else to do, was really a lifesaver for me. So I did exactly what he said. And I went to my GP, who was so brilliant and so sympathetic. And I've met her since, actually. And I've just said, you really understand what you did for me that day. And it was lovely to be able to tell her, looking back, you know, I know it was your job, but actually what you gave me was such an amazing gift, that you listened, you helped, and, you know, you helped just move me that little bit further forward. And eventually I got in to see, I had some counselling. I was going to have CBT, but unfortunately there was only one CBT therapist at the time. So I ended up seeing a psychotherapist. And over the course of many months and, 3 to 4 years, he put me back together again. And to the point where I could function, I could feel better, and I could live. And for all intents and purposes, to the outside world, I was a successful person. You know, I was holding down a job. I had friends. Okay, I didn't have my own house, but, you know, that's not necessarily a recipe for success. But and that's the thing. And at that point, I decided that I could leave my job of 8 years. That was by the time I got to that point, and actually go and do a new job, and go and and forge a new life. And that's what I did. So it was, yeah, a long road, but it kind of got there.
That's wow. So much of what you say there just sort of, I suppose, resonates with me. And in particular, when you were talking about going out to Australia, and it reminded me as well of that quote. Is it a mindfulness quote? I think, wherever you go, there you are. And it's so true, isn't it? All of, like you said, what's happening is happening on the inside.
Yes.
And eventually, I always think of it like a sock drawer, right? You know, everyone's got that sock drawer where they keep stuffing the socks in. Well, I certainly have. Anyway, maybe I've got a sock obsession. I don't know. But I keep stuffing these socks in, and eventually they're popping out the back of the drawer because, like, there's no room in them anymore. And it's like, I think sometimes we do think, like, people do their best to cope with the resources that they have at the time. And or maybe sometimes there's not that realization, I don't know, but we just keep going and keep going and keep going, and eventually, you know, something's got to give, hasn't it? And I think the way you've described that conversation with your dad as well, though, that simple plan is so powerful, because again, people become so lost in the moment of like what to do. And I remember actually like a bit of panic as well, like, what the hell's going on, you know, like, I don't know what to do with this or where to go. And like, you get so consumed with your thoughts around it. Like you say, being able to see the wood from the trees is quite difficult, isn't it, for a lot of people?
Yeah.
So I think, but I'd like to just talk very briefly about the grief recovery method as well, because I know that, so you've described this path for you of you know, into therapy, which really, really helped. And I absolutely agree with that. I think that therapy is, for some people, an important part of the journey of getting back on their feet, like you say, being able to function and survive. And especially when people have had a trauma around, you know, their grief as well, being able to kind of deal with that. But then I think there's this emerging recognition now that it's what happens after that. So I know that the grief recovery method also talks about, you know, this focus on recovery rather than discovery. And I think that what you've described from the therapy and the time that you had there was very much about that kind of discovery, which I think is what, you know, therapy is designed to do and does so brilliantly. So what was it then about the grief recovery method that really kind of worked for you, that made a difference?
In a couple of words, positive action. Not just talking. I mean, when I had my first nervous breakdown, I was very clear. I didn't want antidepressants. I didn't want to mask the feeling that I was feeling. I actually wanted to try and confront it, because I needed to understand what I was dealing with. So that's why I accepted to the counselling, and basically there was the cycle of, I tried every counselling, therapy, you name it, I tried it to make myself feel better. It was almost like, what new thing can I try this week to make myself feel better? So I'd kind of almost done everything as much as I could. But I still couldn't lose this grief. And so when I met this lady who was a specialist called Phil Edmonds, I say by chance, but I don't believe some things are by chance anymore. I think she was meant to be there. I was meant to meet her. And she told me a little bit about grief recovery, and she told me her story, which was that unfortunately her husband had died. He'd committed suicide, he'd taken his own life, and her world had fallen apart. And for 2 years she had struggled she'd lost her job, she'd lost her house, she'd lost everything, and she really didn't know what to do. Somebody told her about grief recovery, and slowly she had learnt the method. She'd decided to offer that out, and she'd actually become a trainer. So she was the trainer that trained me. But when she told me her story, I burst into tears. And I said, but I don't do this anymore. I'm a survivor. And she smiled really sweetly at me, as if to say, I don't know exactly how you're feeling, but I've kind of been sort of where you're at. And so we talked some more, and I decided that I had nothing to lose by, I might as well do it because I tried everything else. Yeah. And so she said, I've got a training program where I actually train people to become specialists in 3 weeks' time. You can either do just work through the program yourself with me as a one-to-one client, or if you're interested, you could do the training. And I kind of, in the back of my mind, had always sort of promised myself, if I ever got through what I was going through, that I would try to help somebody else. So I decided to just go the whole hog and book myself on the training, because you do that, as you do the method as part of the training anyway, because you have to understand what it's like to go through that process. So I went on the program with 11 other amazing ladies who were teachers, counsellors, therapists. I was the only person who wasn't from that background, and I was very nervous, but I thought, well, what have I got to lose? Let's just do it. And I did it. And it was just amazing to finally let go of something that you knew had been bugging you, buzzing around inside for a long, long time. It's not just talking therapy. It's actually split into a structure where you work through those sessions towards a conclusion. And at that conclusion, you let those feelings of grief go. If you've done the work, if you're committed and open to doing it and honest with yourself, it would work. It will work for you. And it's getting that message out there to people, because the grief recovery method is about any sort of loss that you can have as a human being. So it's not just about bereavement, which is what grief tends to conjure up for people. It's about relationship breakup, divorce, redundancy, moving house, which we often think of as not a grief event, but actually is one of the most stressful things that you can do, other than death. Divorce and moving house is probably the third most stressful event that you can do in your lifetime, but we don't think of that as a grief event.
I suppose this is where I'm coming from with the secondary losses and things as well, because even though somebody might deal with, the initial loss that's right in front of them, and that could be, say, losing a loved one, but then, after that happens, you've got all this, like you say, these other losses that occur: loss of self, loss of identity, loss of, finances, all kinds of different things that we have to kind of move through, I guess, in turn, really. And yes, and that I can relate to. I mean, I had a absolute recurrence of grief because, despite having lost my parents and kind of working through that 3 years ago when I moved out to Shropshire, I then had to face the whole selling up the family home and tying up the estate and all of that. And it was like going through a whole other grieving process in itself, and the loss there of, the family home and where I'd grown up and my childhood and all of that. So I absolutely really agree with that there's all these other kind of losses that trigger this grief process that people don't always kind of I guess recognize, and it's really important. I think this is one of the reasons with this podcast why I wanted to do a variety of different stories around loss as well. And it's interesting that the people that I've interviewed around job redundancy and job loss have kind of very often started off by saying, well, this isn't really a loss, but and then kind of gone on to describe this whole journey and process that they've been through, and the struggles and the difficulty and the emotions and the sadness. And it's really interesting, isn't it, how as society we kind of define, like you say, the traditional bereavement.
Very much so. And I think that's the thing. Grief recovery offers us a set of tools that perhaps we're unfamiliar with, that, you know, we learn most of our knowledge about loss and grief from our parents. Well, what happens if our parents didn't have the right information, you know, knowingly or not knowingly, you know, but we've learned from them. We're potentially going to pass it on to our own children. But actually, you know, grief recovery is a re-education about grief. And one of the first things you actually do is look at what they call the myths of grief. This is really about discovering what it is that keeps us stuck, discovering what they call short-term energy relieving behaviors, so what distracts us, and then really trying to drill down in terms of those relationships and actually moving forward, focusing on a personal journey. So you focus on a particular loss to begin with. That's not to say you can't look at other losses, but you perhaps focus on one particular loss and you actually look at that almost. And this is the bit I think that people struggle with, you know, opening that box of emotion and trying to look at it. And what grief recovery offers you and specialists offer you is a safe place to do that. And once you take it out there, hopefully maybe it's not quite as scary as you have been trying to run away from or you are fearful of. You are able to look at it and work through that loss in a structured way, and the end product is really that you let that grief go so you can then move forward with your life. Because I don't think people realize this if you don't externalize it, if you don't let this grief out, you carry it around with you. As I said, you know, the weight of that weighs you down eventually to the point where you've got to you either let it out or it comes out itself. I would just like to say a couple of things in terms of, you know, you'd asked me about words of wisdom earlier, maybe in the sort of briefing, and I try and just sum it up in, you know, don't suffer in silence. There is help out there, whatever loss that you feel you are suffering from. Take courage. You know, I know that sounds really, you know, flippant or whatever, but just try to summon up enough courage and take a tiny step, no matter what it is. A tiny step, whether it's asking somebody for help or just even floating the subject with somebody you know and you feel safe with, and just see how that feels. And then never give up hope. Never give up hope of feeling better. You know, there is always a way to feel better. Just keep taking those tiny little steps and you will. And, you know, before you realize it, you will get to a place where you look back and think, wow, gosh. And I'm sure you resonate with that, because, you know, you've come so far in the 2 years that you started doing this. So, you know, never give up. Just hold on to that fact. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and it is a journey, and you never stop learning. And I have my up days and my down days, but I know things will never be as bad as when I woke up that morning and I just felt I couldn't see to the end of the day. And, you know, my life has changed so much because of grief recovery, and that's now out there. I wish I'd had it 20 odd years ago when I needed it, but it is here now. And please, you know, don't suffer in silence. Just, you know, find out about it through the website, come and ask me about it on Facebook, whatever it is, and I'll try and talk to you and give you as much time as I can, and tell you about it as much as I can.
Excellent words to finish with, Lisa. Thank you so much for that, and thanks for chatting to me today.